Good evening and welcome to a new episode of To The Point, and where we discuss the most important issues of the day. And today we're going to be discussing the UN General Assembly and the outcomes of the UN General Assembly, the most important points that were discussed during the meetings. And joining us this evening to tell us more about it is Dr. Mohamed Halim, a professor of political science at Zazi University. Good evening to you.
Good evening.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Firstly, let's touch on the speech given by the Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry the other day about a lot of different factors, including food security, climate change, and water scarcity as well. Can you tell us your impressions about this speech?
Yeah, it was a very much interesting speech, actually. The sort of the thing that he did deliver at the UN General Assembly, actually. During the previous days, actually, in lieu of His Own Excellency, Mr. President Abdel, actually.
Yes.
And the topic that he did examine in details, actually, could be divided into two main issues, two main parts, distinctive parts. The first is the strategic and the political, the fact that he would inaugurate his own speech by representing his own sense of wonder about, those who would believe that the extreme sense of patience and extreme sense of fortitude on the part of the Egyptian presidency actually could be interpreted in somehow or another as just one point of weakness, whereas it would seem to be quite far from being so. The fact that the sense of patience and the fortitude and extreme sense of the soft diplomacy that the Egyptian presidency actually would manipulate a large number of high-profile issues, as much as the Renaissance Dam, for example, could be interpreted as one sign of greatness, not weakness, actually, on the part of Iran.
He stated this in his speech, that this is not complacency or weakness, it is rather trying to use all means necessarily when it comes to diplomacy rather than,
Yeah, and those who would actually possess the power, the military power, would seem to be quite able to utilize the soft diplomacy and the peaceful means and the peaceful initiations, actually, of dealing with almost all the situations. That's what he did represent at the very beginning of his inauguration of his own speech, actually. And in the meantime, what seems to be quite drastic, the fact that not only the sort of drought, the sort of the climate change and the disastrous menaces, and the sort of, the voices of menace to a greater extent that would besieging and surrounding all the African countries, but actually the inability actually of some countries to abide by the regulations of the international law and to be in somehow or another infringing upon the regulations of the international law as much as Ethiopia is, and Addis Ababa actually he would strike a very good example actually of the sort of infringement actually of Addis Ababa, of Abiy Ahmed, actually, of how he would seem to be quite detracting from the words of the international law to a great extent by his own first, second and third sort of filling of the reservoir that seems to be quite very much...
Yes, he did highlight this point, but one of the main issues that was discussed and also was previously talked about by President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi last week was the idea of climate change and how important it is because it affects every human life, especially when it comes to food security, as well as water security, in addition to a number of other factors, economic factors as well. The foreign minister spoke about how Egypt is trying to support all African nations, in addition to trying to represent them within the UN General Assembly to voice their needs as well when it comes to these issues. Specifically saying that the African continent is at a shorthand, I suppose, when it comes to climate change, since they are the most affected continent and one of the poorest continents as well. How important was it to show that Africa needs a voice and Africa has a voice?
The sense of his own presence actually within that sort of international and very much important summit actually is in somehow or another one way of saying that Egypt is always there actually at the heart of the matter, deciding, selecting, rejecting and actually controlling all the affairs either on a local arena or international level. The fact that one of the major topics that he did tackle actually is the sort of the threats actually that would besiege Africa, the sort of the what that used to be called actually the black continent, whereas it would seem to be quite very far from being so. It's very much resourceful, very much rich in minerals, and very much rich actually of its own natural treasures, so to say. the sort of the thing that had been exploited for a long period of time by the Western world as much as the American administration. What he would seem to be quite highlighting and drawing the attention of the Western world actually is that sort of world actually should be paid for, shouldn't be able to pay the bill for the contamination and for the exploitation of the Western world at the end. And instead, he would draw the attention of the entities and the international bodies as much as the European world at large and the American administration that you would have to be able to pay for the sort of the nuclear attempts and their own exploitation of the natural resources and their own sense of demolishing actually the infrastructure of the African continent for quite some time actually. That's why this is at one point one of the major issues that Mr. Sameh Shoukry, the foreign minister, would speak on behalf of His Own Excellency Mr. Abdel, actually representing what one major fundamental fact, which is that they would have to either be able to minimize the sort of the debt to half of it, or to abolish it in its own conceivable respect, or actually to try to make a sort of what you might call a successful investment actually of rechanging and re-editing, of restructuring actually the infrastructure and paying for the sort of the demolition that had been there for quite some time actually.
One of the shocking figures that the FM spoke about was that 1 in 5 African citizens suffers from hunger. This is quite a shocking statistic, I suppose. How do you think that the UN General Assembly can address this issue? I mean, there are a lot of UN bodies like UNICEF or food aid programs that are available, but this doesn't really actually solve the problem. Like you were saying, there has to be a change in the way things are dealt with. Like there has to be more autonomy and control within the African continent itself to be able to feed themselves.
Absolutely right. Well, I mean, what seems to be quite drastic, the fact that, as you might have said rightly now, is 1 out of 5 would seem to be quite facing a fatalistic end at the end of the day. I mean, either by contamination or diseases or prestiging sort of threatening vices of this in whatsoever form that it may be in there. And in the meantime, actually, the continent as it stands had been dehumiliated for quite a long period of time. The fact that, as I've just said, that the Western world would exploit it actually for quite some time, revolutionary stances and revolutionary aspects and the industrialization itself in Europe. During the course of the previous 19th century, the industrialization and the industrial revolution would leave a deep impact actually not only on Europe but actually on Africa as a continent. And as such, it would seem to be quite very much dehumanizing fact that despite its own outward sense of impoverishment and sense of poverty actually, the fact remains that it's still, as it stands, actually very much rich, very much badly used and badly exploited actually, not by its own indigenous citizens, but outsourcing by, colonialization and colonies actually, such as France, Europe in general. And this is one of the major, facts that Mr. Sameh Shoukry would draw the attention of almost the whole world to. The self-same topic that had been tackled on and upon since quite a couple of weeks ago by Qais Said in Ticket 8, actually, that had been inaugurated in Tunisia under the supervision of the American administration, the World Bank, and in the meantime, proposing a sort of reconstructing, rehabilitating, and re-editing and re-changing, actually, the outward as much as the inward form of the African continent, just by way of trying to give their own simple rights of finding their own, suitable jobs, nice food, as much as fill the gap of what you might call domestic unemployment, actually. This is one of the major issues and one of the major themes that Mr. Sameh Shoukry was quite aware of, and he would harp on and on during the course of his own delivering the sort of the very much successful speech in the session on the 77th session of the UN General Assembly, actually.
Which brings me to the next topic, since like we were talking about the idea of Africa being disenfranchised, I suppose, and being unable to, reach its full potential. The African continent also is the least producer of carbon dioxide and the least problematic continent when it comes to climate change and pollution and so forth. But it would be the continent that is most affected by the climate change. And this is a topic not only Sameh Shoukry spoke about, the foreign minister, but also a lot of other country heads and foreign ministers spoke about climate change and its importance and how it will affect the poorer countries most, even though they are not necessarily the ones who are creators of this problem and issue. Why do you think that there's such a drive right now to talk about climate change? I mean, there's always been COP20, this is maybe 27th session, but there hasn't always been a big hype about it in previous years.
Yeah, well, this is not the very beginning of it. It's a sort of a thing that had been tackled on and upon during the course of about 6 or 7 years ago in Accord de Paris, or the Conference of Paris, or the Paris Agreement, actually, that was to be held in 2015, but to outward seeming just pledged, you know, I mean, examining the topic on the face of it, but deep down, without the least sort of real examination and realistic grounding, actually. That's why it seems to be quite an absolute sense of failure. 7 years have passed with 7, you know, I mean, seasons, actually, without the ability on any individual sort of European country or even Arab country, actually, to re-change and re-edit the map of the road, actually. Then followed by
but there seems to be more momentum to actually do something this time round. Why do you think that there is such a feeling of like, no, we need to do something right now?
Well, I mean, because, I mean, when it is to be immediately followed by Glasgow, that is the COP26, I mean, it's just mere words, actually, in the air, discussed and examined and propagated without even sort of realistic attitudes towards, I mean, reshaping the whole thing. But I think that all these attempts on the part of all these countries, actually, when they would seem to be quite very much badly and notoriously influenced by the climate change, they would reshape and re-edit and re-ask, actually, to be held successfully, as much as to be inaugurated in the COP27 in next November in Sharm el-Sheikh. I think that there is a sense of harping on the drastic need, actually, for minimization of contamination of the bad usages and the utilization of the external surface of the earth, as much as of badly using and inhumanly, I mean, utilizing all these aspects. Because, I mean, the erosion of the coasts, as much as the, you know, I mean, wide expansion of the ozone layer and the sort of floods in Sudan, and the erosion of the coastal sites and a large number of coastal cities, actually, would seem to be quite threatening the lives on Earth, to the extent that at one time Donald Trump did say a couple of days ago that there seemed to be quite what you might call the drastic, sadistic ending of the world in the near future, had it not been to change the map of the road of the American administration, mainly, or namely, Joe Biden's policy, actually, that seems to be quite not in the interests of the American administration, as much as not in the interests of almost the whole world, particularly his own sort of interference so directly and so bluntly, actually, on the Ukrainian-Russian onslaughts, or the Russian-Ukrainian sort of battle, actually, that seems to be quite threatening the world with a third atomic and nuclear sort of war that may be devastating, actually, not only the individual lives of citizens, but actually of all the living cells and all the living creatures, actually, on Earth. The sort of the thing that would necessitate, actually, tackling the problem of the insecurity concerning food, the sharp lack and the sharp shortage, actually, of grains, of wheat, of energy, so to speak. That's why Mr. President of the Tahsisi is calling every now and again, actually, for utilizing the green energy and of finding alternatives for the sort of the traditional oils and traditional fuels, actually, the traditional ways and means through the aid of which people would keep to be acting and reacting with each other. There is a hard need, actually, and there is an insistence on rechanging the whole previous attitudes. This is not a sort of an individual outlook or a personal achievement, actually. It's one way or another of communal attitude to saving what could be saved in the right time and in the right place with the right person, actually, for fear that the extension of the life on the face of the earth, so to speak.
But it also, like, one of the things that were discussed by a number of leaders was basically the idea of multilateralism rather than unilateralism when it comes to international issues and aiding each other, working together as a small village, basically, not as individual countries. This may be something of an importance, but it's also not quite true, because like we've seen actions of certain countries, like you were just saying, that not necessarily go towards the greater goal of humanity in general, but are further pushing the issues at hand, not necessarily nuclear, but it could be like, for instance, the food scarcity that's happening right now because of grains, the lack of grains, the energy crisis that is soon to be an issue in Europe, especially in winter. How can the world sort of get over these issues and start to move forward in a more multilateral way?
It's our own opportunity actually to try to seize the chance, so to speak, actually, of the next COP27, actually, to discuss all these things in details. And I personally would believe that the act of selecting Egypt, actually, to be hosting that sort of international summit is one of the highest chances, actually, for our own Egyptian presidency to tackle all these problems and all these impediments, actually, not only the Renaissance Dam issue, actually, and the sort of the stubborn attitude on the part of Abiy Ahmed, but actually the sort of the shortage of the grains and the wheat and the attempt to try to find an alternative, actually. One way of trying to re-edit the whole thing is to invite the whole world to try to, you know, I mean, utilize the chances that at their own disposal till the very end, which is finding in Africa, for example, the alternative ways and means through the aid of which they could be able actually to serve humanity. Because as I just mentioned, that it's very much rich in animal life, in agricultural tendencies, heavy rain, expansion of acres of lands, actually. But to my own amazement, to my own astonishment, very much badly used by the Western world. And I think that the Decade 8 summit in Tunisia, as much as the upcoming COP27, will be in somehow or another drawing the attention of the whole world towards, I mean, minimizing the sort of the deaths as much as re-instructing and re-editing factories for the African people. And in the meantime, on international arena, it's one way of trying on the part of the European world, as much as the American administration, to find an alternative for the waste land or the waste energy, actually, on the part of Russia, because Russia would utilize each single individual opportunity at its own disposal as an administration, actually, to deprive Europe as much as the NATO, so to speak, and the American administration of energy, particularly during the next winter. That seems to be quite drastic. It's a sort of a menace to their own life on Earth to attend, you know, the sort of to face winter without that sort of ways and means through the aid of which they can get a sense of heat. That's why I think that Africa would be the alternative. That's why you can really find that the Western eyes, as much as the American administration, are casting their own eyes on Africa as an alternative for the sort of the lack of grains and the food and the reservoir of the wheat, as much as finding another ways and means of energetic possible attitudes, actually, towards re-editing their own life. That's why I think that Sergei Lavrov, when he did visit Egypt about 3 weeks ago, was keeping an eye, actually, of how to get into the heart of Africa through Egypt, in much the same way that the American administration, when supervising and hosting the Decade 8 in Tunisia, actually, was one way or another, actually, of minimizing the sort of the Chinese existence within the African coastal line, as much as Africa as a continent. So all the world would seem to be quite finding, actually, in Africa an alternative for the shortage, for the lack, for the sharp extreme sense of sadness and isolation on the part of those European world, particularly when they would seem to be quite facing a very drastic sort of winter in the near future, a couple of weeks or so. They would be quite deprived of their own simple means and ways through the aid of which they can really get heat. The only alternative is in Africa, and I think that Mr. Sameh Shukri was very much sage enough, actually, to utilize that sort of chance to draw the attention of the world. And in the meantime, to find and to draw their own interest, actually, in Africa as much in Egypt as the world's great grain basket, actually, that would provide them with almost all their own daily needs of food and of filling the void of the insecurity on a large scale concerning energy as much as food. So, I mean, this is a very interesting chance for our own Egyptian presidency, actually, to not only discuss one of the major you know, I mean, quagmirish aspects, which is, you know, I mean, the Renaissance Dam and its own obstacle that had been put within the road of negotiation, but it's another way from the economic point of view, which is filling the gap from the shortage of the grains and the wheat and the food, and achieving a sense of security at the end of the day, finding an alternative for the sort of the thing that had been quite missing from the European world and the Western world at large, actually.
Like you were saying, there's going to be issues in the very near future when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine crisis for the entire world. But it seems that things are increasing in the level of tension. It's not decreasing or de-escalating. Like, for instance, in the UN General Assembly, we've seen the French president talk about, how Russia is, unilaterally taking moves and so forth, and also speaking about how anyone who's on the fence is against, freedoms or whatever. And on the Russian side as well, we're seeing them up the ante. And, doing a lot of things, including the gas price issues, the cutting off the gas, providing Edward Snowden, for instance, with nationality, Russian nationality. We're not seeing a de-escalation of the issue. Who benefits from such a move? I mean, it seems that everyone is at a disadvantage. The average citizen is the one who's losing at the end of the day.
True, the African one, you mean?
Not just Africans, I mean even the Europeans.
The individual figures, actually, are losing.
Yes.
Well, I mean, this is the sort of the game of policy, actually. Mr. President Fattah Sisi at one time did say that when the superpowers would struggle within each other, within any sort of individual jungle or forest, they would seem to be quite getting higher and higher issues and aims as much as achieving the highest goals that could be achieved. Whereas the only losers are those very much tiny figures. And those would seem to be quite unable actually to eat even the bushes and the trees. So the individual would seem to be quite losing. You have just said, so this is the game of policy. And when that sort of struggle among the superpowers, it would, demolish almost all the living creatures on Earth. That's why I think that the initiation, the part of the Egyptian presidency actually is very much fruitful at this particular stage, because, our own diplomacy and soft diplomacy actually is viewing the sort of the benefit and the interest of the individual goals of the Egyptian individual average citizen, actually, without the sort of the maximization of the international goals at the expenses of the individual figures. So, we are aiming at achieving peace, security, tolerance, as much as diplomacy. And this is quite clarified in the initiation of the problematic issue of the Renaissance Dam. To outward seeming, a large number of political analysts actually would find the only result and the only solution actually is through the military interference, actually just by way of putting an end for the sort of 10 years headache, so to speak. Whereas actually the Egyptian diplomacy has got something else actually, which is negotiation till the very end, tackling the road of peace, and taking the whole thing actually to the International Criminal Court and actually UN General Assembly, to a large number, even to the African Union. And after all these things, actually what would seem to be quite looming large from the speech of Mr. Samah Shukri, the foreign minister, is that this is one sign of greatness, not one single individual point of weakness on our own soft diplomacy, in our own presidential authority, actually. And we have got our own disposal, and we've got our own ways and means. We have got our own armed forces, actually, and the ways and the means through the aid of which you can really achieve the sort of the thing in the right time, within the right place, through the right figure, within a particular perspective, actually. So all these things would seem to be quite part and parcel of the daily routine, actually, that should be exploited to the greater extent without the least to the sort of the military interference, actually. This is one of the final tendencies, actually, and the final destinations, actually, that should be tackled in detail.
Correct me here if I'm wrong. As far as I can understand, at the heart of politics and policy, as well as diplomacy, is basically economics. That's basically it. Everyone wants to be financially stronger. Superpowers are superpowers not simply because of their military might, but because of their economic abilities as well. How is this continuing on when it is actually affecting the entire world? Not just, it's not just, us as an African continent or just Europe, but it is affecting the entire world, and there is a recession globally. why is this continuing on? Why aren't they trying to find some sort of diplomatic solutions to recover economically?
Well, I mean, both are very much connected to each other. That is, politics with, economy. Both would seem to be quite continuing each other. During the course of the previous ages and years, actually, the axiom or the proverb that would necessitate that survival is for the fittest. Nowadays, the whole thing is absolutely changed. Survival is not for the fittest. Not for those who seem to be quite able to keep to life, basically, but for the strongest, for the loudest, for the shroudest, and even for the highest in voice, actually, for the most and the richest, actually. And as such, those superpowers actually would try to utilize and take advantage of all these countries and of all these continents that seem to be quite what you might call the third world country, or the third world entities, or the third world continents, actually, or the what you might call the developing world, developing countries. Well, I hate using that sort of terminology, but it seems to be quite usable, actually, and viable in the ways and means through the aid of which the superpowers would act and react with each other. That's why they would seem to be quite very much utilizing all the richest attitudes and all the treasures, actually, of all these countries to a greater extent, just by way of achieving the sort of the colonial outlook, the imperial way of life.
But we're seeing, the effects, the economic and financial effects of what's happening, not just with us, but we're seeing it in America and we're seeing it in Russia because of the sanctions and because of price hikes and so forth. How is this beneficial for both sides? Well,
I mean, they would get the money, they would utilize it in reproducing ammunition and weaponries, selling it to the third world countries to tussle and fight with each other just by way of paying the pill. And as such, they would seem to be quite far from being ethical, actually. The sort of the thing of the reproduction of the mass destruction weapons, actually, to be utilized, actually, in what you might call the third generation war and the fourth generation aspects, actually, of war, that would seem to be quite demolishing each other. It's one way of another of initiating a sort of a struggle on a distance, the sort of the thing that most of the superpowers would live on and upon. But in the meantime, I think that things have changed to a great extent because of the vast changes that would seem to be quite threatening the lives of the people here, there, and everywhere in Europe, in Arab countries as much as in the Western world and in America as well. They would seem to be quite, looking for more peaceful and diplomatic ways and means through the aid of which they can deal with other countries. That's why I think that the next COP27, all world countries actually would come with one single individual aim and intention, which is finding a way to survive, to keep as much as long as can be, actually, very much peacefully, exchanging sorts of things and sorts of ideas and diplomacies of diplomacies, as much as grains, as much as food in the meantime. Because after the, at the backdrop of pandemic of COVID-19 that would last for about a couple of years, then followed by the Russian-Ukrainian onslaught, actually seems to be quite one of the drastic episodes, actually, that would devastate perhaps the whole world. And I think that they are quite aware and quite conscious of the besieging danger and the sort of the surmount aspects of dangerous attitudes of utilizing all these things. That's why I think that danger would endanger their own lives and would besiege their own necks till it would put an end for their own lives. That's why they find it a bit better 1,000 times actually to reach to a peaceful settlement, to try to reach an agreement, consensus of opinion, that win-to-win situation actually, that we could complete each other. We can continue with each other, finding a ways and means. That's why, Mr. Samah Shukri was quite aware of that sort of thing when we proposed, the sort of abolishing all the debts or minimizing them to the half of it, or even to try to re-edit the whole thing by reshaping the investment, finding ways and means so that they can really fill jobs and job market as much as building factories. All these things from economic point of view on the part of our own initiator, that is Mr. Samah Shukri, would help in somehow or another to reintegrate and to reopen the minds of the Western world and the American administration to one main individual fact, which is the importance and necessity to reach the consensus of opinion during the next COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in November.
Hopefully it'll be a success. One of the issues that was also discussed within the General Assembly, that was highlighted also by the Canadian Foreign Minister, was the idea of a stronger UN. I mean, the UN is not a very effective body. To be honest, it really isn't that effective. They come out with resolutions and so forth, but they're not quite as effective, especially when there are certain countries with veto powers. I mean, it's not quite a fair way of dealing with an international community, I suppose. Do you think that the possibility of change within the UN and a more effective UN is in the horizon, or is it something that is
Well, I said
possible?
a couple of minutes ago, is the survival is not for the fittest, but for the strongest. And in the interests of almost all these entities and all these superpowers, actually, that they would seem to be at the top of the social pyramid, actually, possessing power, decision-taking, decision-making, and as such, they would seem to be quite superimposing and controlling the whole world. Had it not been for that sort of, powerful entities and that sort of ascendancy and their own existence on the top of the social pyramid, they wouldn't be able in somehow or another actually to supervise and re-edit the whole shape and the map of the world. And as such, I think that any sort of individual attempt to re-edit and reshape the UN structure or entity in favor of all those, third world countries, or utilizing the idea of justice on a general sense, wouldn't seem to be quite effective to a greater extent. They would seem to be maximizing their own sense of power, their own powerful attitudes to try to, extend their own hands of power here, there, and everywhere. This is a colonial outlook. This is their own imperial sense of utilizing their own ways and means, through the aid of which they can really impose their own decision-taking, as I've just said. That's why it's one of the very much fake and very much deceptive attitudes and diplomatic ways and means, through the aid of which they try.
Something.
Yeah. Yes. Whereas, I mean, they would seem to be quite propagating something to outward seeming. They would seem to be quite propagating justice, diplomacy, equality, peace here, there, and everywhere, where deep down they would seem to be quite committing the most horrible crimes, far from being human and humane. That's the way those people would seem to be quite for a long period of time. They would exchange the sense of power, the sense of superimposing their own stretching, their own powerful hands on a large number of third world countries, just by way of extending their own sense of manipulation and real manipulative attitudes of the Mediterranean world.
Regardless of how manipulative these developed countries may be, but it doesn't seem, I mean, like you were saying, on a colonial perspective, it might even be, subconscious. We haven't seen the sort of outcry that we've seen when it came to the Ukraine-Russia war in many other different issues and crises around the world, like, for instance, what's happening in Syria, or the Palestinian cause, or, the Iraqis that have died, the 1 million Iraqis that have died during the US invasion. There wasn't this outcry. There wasn't this big or loud voice, demanding, oh, you have to stop human rights, freedom, and all of this. Why do you think that it's only when it's a white man's issue, I suppose?
Well, I mean, it's just a sort of getting a piece of the cake among all those superpowers, actually.
Yes.
You have mentioned kindly, actually, Libya, Syria, Iraq, and all these devastated lands, that would never ever actually be able to restore and regain their own supremacy on their own indigenous lands again, actually. And I think that Mr. President Fattah Sisi said at one respect in one of his own most interesting speeches that the kingdom of the country that would disappear from Earth would never ever be able actually to restore its own existence again, or for the second time. That's what did occur concerning Iraq, Yemen, Libya, even Libya, actually the sort of the land that had been devastated. A large number of militias, of Daesh groups, and Palermo, of Berlin, of Khairat, a large number of meetings and summits, actually, more than 6 or 7 summits, actually, that are to be, in every conceivable respect, touching on spreading peace and security, of restoring the land, of, of exploiting the sort of the natural resources and the oil. And at the end of the day, it seems to be an absolute sense of fiasco or failure.
Yeah, but even if there wasn't these sorts, like if we remove Iraq out of the equation, since it was a US invasion, we can look at the other issues like Syria, for instance. This is not necessarily something that is related to an invasion or so forth, but it is a humanitarian crisis. we didn't see any form of outcry or outreach for the Syrians as much as we've seen to the Ukrainian crisis. We've seen Europe open their arms up, I suppose, to
well, the case in Syria is a bit different because, I mean, they would extend and prolong the sort of the struggle to a greater extent because of the Golan Heights, because of its own, the nearest approach to Israel. Israel, it's in the interests of Israel, actually, to keep an eye and to be there, actually, in the Golan Heights, to be able to supervise, actually, almost the whole arena, because those who would ascend and surmount the Golan Heights in Syria would seem to be quite able to supervise, perhaps, the whole area of the Middle East.
Yes.
So the case in Syria is different. It's different from Libya. It's one way of prolonging the sort of the struggle in Syria and initiating the sort of the
I mean, it's not just Syria. I'm not talking about just the Middle East. Even in areas that we've seen, like Myanmar, there isn't as much of an outcry.
Well, I'll tell you something. I mean, whenever you feel that you would like to put an end for Israel, for example, in Yemen, when you reach to Hudaybiyah, you feel that the stoppage in the struggle. A fight in Libya, but when you reach to Tripoli, actually it is stopped. In Syria, in Halab, actually, when you reach to Halab, almost everything would seem to be stopping. When almost the problematic situation is to be solved in its own final decision and its own final moments, something would approach and would loom large, actually, that would necessitate the stoppage of the struggle in the benefit and in the interests of the Western world, actually, not the indigenous citizens of all these countries. That's why there is a hidden agenda. There is an interest at the minds of almost those people, actually, that would keep the treasures. They would seem to be quite superimposing their own hands on these lands, that in the interests of their own concern, actually, not to be able actually to let them actually to get a sense of democracy or freedom of speech or individualization, to select and reject what sort of leader or president that they would have to say their own say about it. This is in the interests of the Western world. That's why, as you might have said right now, and rightly actually, that the Middle East, it's in their own eyes actually a much better 1,000 times to be on a turmoil land, actually, not very much settled, not very much peaceful, very much divided among each other, sects and creeds and religious attitudes and tendencies among the people, actually, to find something to struggle for, something to keep going for.
But it's not just Middle East, that's the thing. It is a developing countries, if you will, problem in general. Like the African continent has a lot of, strife. There's a lot of issues in a lot of different countries, as well as poor Asian countries as well.
But not internally, actually. I mean, it's, for example, the United States of America, despite the fact that there are some protestations and some protestants, actually, and some attitudes to react against the Joe Biden's, for example, administration, they would seem to be quite describing it, actually, as the land of constitution or the land of an institution, the land of morals and ethical details to outward seeming, whereas they would seem to be quite far from being so. But the picture is wholly different in the Middle East. Those Arab countries, in their own interests, actually, to leave them very much unable to decide to select and reject, to say yes or no, what sort of thing that they would have to be opting for. And this is, in the interests I've just said, just by way of getting snatches and pieces of the cake, actually, of the fortunes, despite the fact that Khalifa Qasim Haftar and the previous governments, actually, in Libya, in Syria, were asking if now and again, actually, to let the indigenous citizens or the Libyan citizens to represent their own simple right to select their own sort of leader. But at the end of the day, they aren't. They are not entitled. They are not able to select the sort of the leader that they would opt for. And as such, the fortune is to be actually slipping out of their own hands, actually, among the Daesh groups sometimes, among the militias that are very much, contradictory among each other, among the Western world. France, Italy, America, Russia, Italy, all these countries have got their own interests in Libya. That's why I'm not anticipating, actually, in the near future, actually, to be wholly settled, because from our own previous experiences of the summits that had been held to outward seeming to try to liberate Libya from the militias and the Daesh groups and the militants and the struggle among the tribes, it seems to be quite far from being so. They are very much interested, whenever they would reach to a consensus of opinion of selecting a leader, that you find that the tribal entities and the tribes would struggle among each other. They would contradict each other just by way of the interest of the Western world.
Yes, hopefully with all that was said during the UN General Assembly, there might be real change, which may not be, yeah, it may not happen, but that's the hope for the average human, I suppose. Do you think, on your final words for us on this show, because it's almost out of time, do you think that there will be some sort of continuation of this sort of discussion during the COP? It's not just going to be focused on climate change, because all of these other issues are interconnected.
Yeah, right. Well, I said that part of it is the economic side, but one major hidden fact, which is the political side, which I think that one of the major entities, one of the major subjects that will be tackled on and upon, that will be insisted actually just by way of representing our own perspective to the whole world, which is the problematic situation of the Renaissance Dam, tackling it, representing the sort of infringement upon the international law, the sort of the not abiding by the agreement of principles actually on the part of the Ethiopian side, and representing to the world at large the peaceful initiations of the Egyptian presidency, harping on diplomatic ways and means through which they would tackle any sort of individual, local or international issue. And in the meantime, one major fundamental fact, which is the besieging danger and the sort of the threatening details and instant menace actually on the part of the climate change that would come from the Renaissance Dam, not only for the downstream countries, that is Egypt and Sudan, but actually to the whole continent actually. This is one of the major issues that would be quite devastating: the climate change, floods, besieging rains, droughts to a greater extent, the inability actually to raise cattle and sheep, and this, the contamination of life in general. All these things would seem to be quite coming out from the sort of supervising and superimposing their own hands on the water, which has been described as the gift of God, actually not only to be represented to one sort of individual sort of country, but to the whole continent, not one individual Ethiopia, I would say, already.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you so much for enlightening us on your perspective of the UN General Assembly and the most important points that were discussed during the Assembly itself. Dr. Mohamed Abdel Halim, a professor of political science at Azit University, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us. This brings us to the end of this episode of To The Point, but stay tuned for more on Nile TV.